Good evening. Thank you so much for coming out tonight. My name is Andy Graybill, and I'm a professor of history and director of the Clement Center for Southwest Studies here at SMU. I think actually it looks just about every seat is taken, but if you are sitting on the edge and want to create a little space for people who might be standing, you can do that church thing and move in towards the middle as you like. Anyway, many folks across campus have helped make this event possible, and I'd like to thank them for their support, starting with our good pals at the Center for Presidential History here at SMU, especially Jeffrey Engel, the director, and Rana Spitz, his right hand. Thanks also to Carissa Cloward and the Dedman College Interdisciplinary Institute, especially at Scott Hawkins Lecture Fund. Thanks to Maria Dixon Hall and the SMU Cultural Intelligence Initiative, and Dean Matt Myers and Steve Denson of the Cox School of Business. And thanks too to the Clement Center's indispensable Assistant Director, Ruth Ann Elmore. So we do a fair number of events here at the Clement Center, but this one I'm particularly excited about, less because of the topic. Okay, I'm kidding. I didn't mean that. Just fine, I guess. But rather because of my deep fondness for our guest, whom I've known for 33 years, when we were both much younger and when he actually wasn't bald. You'll be able to see for yourself in just a moment. Although I probably should, be careful not to cast the first stone. David Leonhardt is a senior writer for the New York Times, where he has worked since 1999. He's held an astonishing array of cool positions there, as a business reporter, as an economics columnist, as the founder and editor of The Upshot, which made numbers and data accessible even to innumerate people like me. He's co-host of The Argument podcast with his colleagues Michelle Goldberg and Ross Douthat, and he was also the Washington bureau chief. Many of you might know David for his latest venture at The Times, which is as the writer and editor of The Morning, a newsletter produced by the New York Times, which he established in spring 2020, and which is read by more than 5 million people every day. Or, to put it another way, many millions more than probably any academic in the history of the United States, alas. David was named finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in commentary in 2010, and he silenced his mocking friends when he actually won the award the following year in 2011. But what have you done for us lately, David? Well, the answer to that is his new book, Ours Was the Shining Future, the Story of the American Dream, which he will speak about this evening. David will be happy to answer your questions afterwards about the book, of course, but also other subjects in the news these days. Please, no questions for him about the crushing loss of his Houston Astros to our beloved Texas Rangers in the Major League Baseball playoffs. There are books for purchase and for signing outside after you have bought your copy, or some of you may already come with copies in hand. David will be up here to sign them afterwards. So please join me in welcoming David Leonhardt.
What a treat to be in Dallas. Thank you all, and congrats on your first World Series championship. I'm sure more may follow later. Thank you all for having me. I know multiple schools came together to make this happen. I particularly want to thank Ruth Ann and Rana for all they've done to make this visit possible. I want to thank Andy Graybill and the Clement Center for Southwest Studies, and Jeff Engel and the Center for Presidential History. It's a treat to watch both of these centers become nationally recognized, and deservedly so. So as Andy told you, I'm going to talk a little bit about my book tonight, and then I look forward to hearing any questions you have about the book or about anything else, any of the other stories in the news. I know people sometimes have complaints about the New York Times. I'm happy to field those as well. I mean that. So I'm going to start by telling you a little bit of a story of a family that was growing up in Jacksonville, Florida, around the turn of the 20th century. The parents were named James and Elizabeth Randolph. They had 2 boys named James and Asa Randolph. And James, the father, was a preacher. The congregations where he preached tended to be out in the outlying areas of Jacksonville, didn't make a lot of money. Elizabeth Randolph ran a small sewing business out of their home, and they also grew some fruit in the back that they sold. And while neither James nor Elizabeth had much education, they believed deeply in the idea that their boys should grow up to have education. And they really emphasized that their boys read a lot, not just the Bible, given that their dad was a preacher. They also read Jane Austen, they read Charles Darwin, they read Charles Dickens, they read African history, they read American history. Asa Randolph was a standout student at the local high school. He played baseball, he was the valedictorian, he sang. And you can understand why a young black man growing up in Jacksonville, Florida in the early 20th century might not want to stay in Jacksonville, Florida. So Asa went north to New York after high school. He took night classes at City College. He became a soapbox orator in Harlem during the Harlem Renaissance, and he became recognized for just what a fantastic public speaker he was. He also began writing for local publications. His politics were pretty far left, and he became the editor of a journal called The Messenger. The Justice Department at the time was tracking radicals in the early 20th century, and they said that The Messenger, under its editor, was by long odds the most able and the most dangerous of all Negro publications. Around this time, Asa realized he really liked writing and he was going to focus on it, and he decided that Asa Randolph was not a sufficiently august byline. So he did what many journalists do, is he took a slightly different version of his name to be his byline. It's a name more of you will recognize than Asa Randolph. It was A. Philip Randolph. And he was such a good writer and such a good speaker that a local group that was trying to organize the porters on the Pullman Railroad Company and the maids on the Pullman Railroad Company, they came to A. Philip Randolph after one of his speeches, and they said, would you be willing to help organize our workers? And A. Philip Randolph thought about it for a little while and eventually said yes. And I think it's important in retrospect to reflect on just what a phenomenal underdog movement this was. This is 1925 in the United States. Labor unions have lost essentially every fight that they've tried to have over the previous quarter century. Every time they've tried to organize, the company where they've tried to organize has ignored them, or they've violently suppressed the strike, and they've said, we're not going to recognize you, we're not going to negotiate with you. And A. Philip Randolph wasn't merely trying to organize any union. He was trying to organize the first significant union of black Americans in the United States. And he wasn't just trying to do it at any company. He was trying to do it at the Pullman Company, which it's a little bit hard today to describe just how powerful the Pullman Company was. J.P. Morgan, the man, was on the board. A Whitney had been on the board. Alfred Sloan had been on the board. And so this was a phenomenal long-shot effort to organize a labor union of black Americans in 1925. But they decided they were going to try to do it anyways. And at the organizing meeting for the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, they left the maids out of the name, a small bit of sexism, in 1925. A. Philip Randolph said to the gathered porters and maids, the history of all groups in America and everywhere else who are at the bottom of the economic ladder is that they raise themselves up and create a viable life for themselves only through organization. And that's what A. Philip Randolph said that he was going to do for the maids and the porters. They spent more than a decade losing fight after fight after fight. They first organized a whole bunch of porters and maids, and then the Depression came and many of them quit because they were worried that they would be fired for joining a union. Many other leaders in the black community sided with the Pullman Company and said, this is a major employer. Why are we going to risk having our people be fired to form this union? They referred to A. Philip Randolph as a Bolshevik hustler and wormy Pullman fruit. At one point during the Depression, the union couldn't meet its payment on its Harlem headquarters, and its furniture was thrown out into the street as part of an eviction of the movement. But A. Philip Randolph didn't give up. He and his allies continued trying to organize the porters, and eventually, over the course of the 1930s, were able to get many more to join the union again, as they had before the Depression. And then the story turns. The defeat of labor unions that had happened again and again and again in the 19-teens and 1920s starts to change because there is a government in Washington that says workers should actually have the right to organize and bargain collectively with their employers if they want. This, of course, was the Roosevelt administration. And at first, the Supreme Court overrules the various legislation that would allow workers to organize, but then Roosevelt wins a second term and starts saying really mean things about the Supreme Court. He even threatens to pack it, which, as we all know, was a failure. Except it wasn't totally a failure because the Supreme Court got scared enough that they stopped overturning all of his legislation. And in 1937, the Supreme Court, in a surprise, upheld a law that allowed the railroad industry workers to unionize. 3 days later, after 12 years of ignoring the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, the Pullman Company offered to negotiate with the union. A few months after that, they signed a deal. It included a 40% reduction in the average work week, the average number of hours that they were working. And let's just say they weren't working a short work week after this deal. So just think about how long they were working before the deal. It included a 30% raise for the maids and a 15% raise for the porters. This deal was a phenomenal victory. It made A. Philip Randolph perhaps the most famous black man in America. And instead of resting on his laurels, he continued to try to live his basic idea, which is that the way people lift themselves up is through organization. And he decided we are going to use this union that happens to not just have people in any one city, but these are railroad porters, right? They're spread all across the country. And many of them had a cachet in their community. They traveled to other communities. They would bring home newspapers. They would talk to people in their community. They weren't highly paid, but they were leaders in their community. And he realized that we can turn this into a political movement. And so a few years later, in 1941, with the United States on the cusp of entering World War II, Randolph realized that this was going to be an enormous economic boom, the war was. But black Americans were not allowed to join the military in 1941, or they weren't allowed to serve in integrated units, and they were not allowed to work in the factories that in 1941, before Pearl Harbor, were already gearing up to help arm Britain and the American allies. And so A. Philip Randolph decided, why don't we stage an enormous protest in Washington to demand that the United States integrate the military and integrate its wartime factories? And he came up for a name for this march, the March on Washington. And the March on Washington was going to be held in 1941 to make these two demands: integrate the military, integrate wartime factories. And at first, Randolph said, we are going to get 10,000 people to come march on Washington. And the porters had so much success getting people excited about this that Randolph upped the number to 100,000. And it seemed clear that there was going to be an enormous march, overwhelmingly of black Americans, in Washington in 1941. And Randolph's old ally, FDR, decided he didn't like this at all. It was going to humiliate the United States on the world stage at a time when the United States was trying to show itself as a symbol of democracy and contrast itself with fascism and communism. And so FDR sent his emissary to the civil rights movement, Eleanor Roosevelt, to meet with Randolph and try to persuade him to cancel the march. And she said to him, you can't hold this march. Washington is a southern city. Your marchers will be beaten by the police. Where are your marchers going to stay that night? It won't be safe for them. And Randolph refused to cancel the march. So FDR then used his other card. He summoned Randolph and two other civil rights leaders to the Oval Office to meet with them and try to persuade them to cancel the march. And I should pause here to tell you that A. Philip Randolph was famous for being extremely well-dressed and a wonderful public speaker, a somewhat florid public speaker. Someone said about Randolph, his only vanity was his manners. And so Randolph walks into the Oval Office, and FDR starts the meeting by greeting him and saying, "Hello, Phil," which is what he went by commonly. "Which class were you in at Harvard?" Now, you may recall that A. Philip Randolph attended night classes at City College. He was not in any class at Harvard. But Roosevelt, who of course was at Harvard, had confused Randolph's general elegance, thinking, well, anyone that elegant must have gone to Harvard. So he begins this meeting with a little bonhomie of what class were you at Harvard? And Randolph says, "Mr. President, I did not go to Harvard." And Roosevelt says, "Well, we both share a great commitment to social justice." And Randolph says, "That we do." And they start talking. And the meeting that didn't start off very well actually gets worse from there. And Roosevelt orders Randolph to cancel the march and becomes quite angry about it. And think for a minute about the pressure on Randolph in this moment. Roosevelt has just been reelected to a third term, something no president before or since has been elected to. The United States is getting ready to go to war, and the President of the United States is ordering A. Philip Randolph, a black man in the United States in 1941, to cancel a march. And Randolph says no. And he said no again because of the same principle that I mentioned, that he cited during his organization of the Elks Lodge, which is people are able to lift themselves up through organization. And Randolph understood that he had created enough political power in that moment that he, not the President of the United States, held the cards, had the leverage. He knew that Roosevelt didn't want the United States to be embarrassed on the world stage. He knew that Roosevelt's promises of, "I'll set up a commission and we'll look at the integration of wartime factories," meant nothing if he canceled the march. And so Roosevelt folded. And after the meeting began drafting an executive order that did not integrate the military. He didn't fold on that, but did integrate wartime factories. And Randolph's close aide, Bayard Rustin, there's a movie just out about him, or soon to be out about him, said, "Well, we have to hold the march because he did only one of our two demands." And Randolph said, "Are you crazy? Like, we just got the President of the United States to fold. We are canceling the march." And wartime factories were integrated. And it began an incredibly important economic rise for black Americans. They were basically dealt into, not by any means, the full American economy, but they were dealt into a major part of the American industrial economy of the 40s and 50s. The black-white pay gap in the 1940s substantially shrunk. The black-white life expectancy gap substantially shrunk. This is all before the great civil rights movement. And of course, the phrase March on Washington never went away. 22 years later, A. Philip Randolph and Martin Luther King and other civil rights organizers used the very same name for the 1963 March on Washington, at which A. Philip Randolph was the opening speaker that day. And I tell you the story because I think it helps underline how the United States created the great economy of the decades after World War II. There were advantages that the United States had in those years that we can never recreate. Europe and Japan were recovering from war. The Southern Hemisphere was still emerging from colonialism. Russia and China were living under communism, which doesn't work. And so the United States had advantages that we can't recreate today. But our American society also has had features back then that we could recreate today. And I think one of them is the idea of political organization that Randolph's life embodied in both labor unions and the civil rights movement. That notion of political organization is why, in the 1940s and 50s and 60s, the wages of middle-class Americans and poor Americans rose faster than the incomes of rich Americans. We may think that rising inequality is some sort of natural law of economics, like gravity is in physics, but it's not. For decades in this country, we had shrinking inequality. We had people who make low incomes getting larger percentage raises than people with high incomes. And the labor movement was an absolutely central reason. The labor movement created by Philip Randolph and by the UAW and by many other parts of society. A second reason that Americans did so well in these decades is that we had a different kind of corporate culture. I don't think the CEOs of past generations were better human beings than the CEOs today, but they did behave more patriotically. They did behave in more communally minded ways, and they did behave less selfishly. In the book, I tell the story of George Romney, Mitt's dad, who was an executive, CEO at a Detroit car company, American Motors. And his contract called for him to get a bonus that would have put his salary over $200,000, which is the equivalent of a few $1,000,000 today. Not exactly a major payday for a CEO today. And George Romney went to his board and he said, I know we've hit all of our marks. I know I am due this bonus, but I think it would be unseemly for me to make that much more money than any of my workers. And I think it would get our company too focused on money. Will you please rewrite my contract to cancel my bonus? And the board did. And it wasn't just George Romney. CEOs even back then had the ability to have an enormous amount of influence over their own pay, but they didn't push for giant paydays for themselves the way that CEOs do today. They were existing in a different culture. I actually think the Romneys are a particularly interesting example because I think George and his son Mitt are both deeply honorable people. They're incredibly similar in so many ways. They had successful business careers. They're leaders in the Mormon church. They then decided to enter politics. They were willing to buck their own political party. They got elected governor. They ran for president and didn't win. They look almost identical in their 70s. I was doing my historical research on George Romney around the same time that I happened to have a meeting with Mitt Romney. And he walked in the room and I almost gasped because I felt like George Romney had just walked out of the pages of an old book. And yet, when confronted with decisions about how much money each should make, they made very different decisions. Mitt Romney never voluntarily returned a bonus at Bain Capital. He made hundreds of millions of dollars. I don't think that's because Mitt is somehow different from George. I think they lived in different cultures, and I think George Romney and the corporate cultures of past decades cared more about workers at their company and more about their communities, and yes, more about their country in their behavior than executives do today. I think a third thing is different is that in the past as a society we invested more in the future than we do today. I was on Think, the Dallas radio show this afternoon, and the host and I talked a lot about the fact that if you wake up today, this is from the book, if you wake up today in a major city in the United States and you want to travel by flight to another city in the United States, your trip is going to take longer than it did 50 years ago. What an indictment of our modern society. You will wake up and sit in more traffic on your way to DFW or Love Field. You will have to get there 2 hours early to go through security. Your scheduled flight time will then be longer than it was 50 years ago in many cases. The scheduled flight time between Los Angeles and New York is 30 minutes longer than it was 50 years ago. Airplane technology has not advanced in ways that speed the trip, and our skies are more crowded, and our air traffic system can't handle it, so the flight is slower than it used to be. Then you'll land wherever you're going, and of course, you'll deal with some of the same hassles there. We have not reached some final frontier of travel efficiency. In many other societies, travel has gotten faster over the last 50 years. I've been in Shanghai, and I've taken a train from downtown Shanghai to the Shanghai airport. For reference, downtown Shanghai and the Shanghai airport are further away than Times Square and LaGuardia Airport. My train in Shanghai took 8 minutes from downtown Shanghai to the Shanghai airport. You cannot get from Times Square to LaGuardia Airport in 28 minutes, let alone 8 minutes, unless it's the middle of the night. It's not just transportation. We used to lead the world in educational attainment. If you're over 60 years old, you're part of the most educated generation in the world. If you're under 40 in America, you are not part of the most educated generation in the world. We used to devote more of our economic output to federal investment in basic R&D and scientific research. The president who oversaw the biggest increase in federal R&D was that noted socialist Dwight D. Eisenhower. We don't focus as much on the future as we used to. And I think this is an important thing. Whether you are a conservative who will naturally believe in less government or a liberal who will naturally believe in more government, I would encourage you to think about how much of our government and our taxpayer dollars are focused on the future as opposed to the present. There are many worthwhile programs that have to be focused on the present. Social Security, anti-poverty programs, Medicare. But those are not investments in the future in the way that education and building roads and investing in R&D is. And over time, a shrinking portion of our government spending has been investment in the future. And when you invest less in the future, you get a future that is less bright than we used to have. And that is basically what has happened in many different ways in our society over the last 40 years. The reasons are complex. I am happy to talk about them in more depth in the Q&A. I think both parties deserve some blame. I think the Republican Party has adopted an economic idea that was perhaps reasonable when it adopted it in 1980, that less government would naturally be better, that if we lowered taxes and got rid of regulation and allowed companies to stamp out unions the way they could in the 1920s and allow companies to grow much, much larger the way they were in the late 19th century, that this would lead to prosperity for all. That was what the laissez-faire revolution was sold. It was sold on that promise. This will lead to prosperity for all. And if you look at the record, it has not done that. Since 1980, inequality has soared. The wages of the poor and the middle class have grown much more slowly than the wages of the rich, and they've grown more slowly than our economy has grown. If you look at other measures, like the percentage of people who grow up with two parents, like the percentage of Americans who spend time behind bars at some time in their life, like the percentage of Americans who suffer chronic pain, all these measures have worsened since the 1980s. If you ask Americans, are they happy with our direction, whether the economy is growing or shrinking, whether there's a Republican president or a Democratic president, Americans are not happy with our country's direction. And then, for me, what is the absolute killer of a statistic in terms of ending the debate about whether life since 1980 has actually been one great boom or not, it is this, and it's the first chart in my book. In 1980, the United States had a typical life expectancy for a rich country, similar to parts of Western Europe, similar to Canada. Today, we have the lowest life expectancy of any rich country in the world, lower than every country in Western Europe, lower than Canada, lower than Japan, lower than Australia. And as you'll see from the chart, it's not even that close. We're way behind those other countries. It didn't have to be this way. It wasn't always this way. But we are now, and have been for quite some number of decades, an outlier in terms of human flourishing relative to many rich countries. That's my criticism of the Republican Party, although some of that applies to the Democratic Party too. My more specific criticism of the Democratic Party is that the Democratic Party used to be a party that viewed itself as representing working people. And although it still views itself in that way, today in many ways it is disdainful of the views of working class people. The Democratic Party has increasingly become a party of highly educated professionals and college graduates. And not only that, but it often tells working class people that their views are not acceptable and that if only they were smarter or more educated, they would have different views. The Democratic Party told people this during COVID, when many people said, why are our schools shut down for so long? And many on the political left said, well, that's because if you're in favor of opening schools, you're in favor of killing people. The Democratic Party tells people that about immigration. They say if you are in favor of border security, it's because you are not a welcoming person. And it's, when you look at the research, it's one of the reasons why the Democratic Party has not become competitive in Texas and Florida in nearly the speed that it thought it would be. A review of the 2020 election in Texas by a progressive group trying to figure out why the Democratic Party lost so much ground among Latinos in 2020 cited two issues: COVID closures and immigration. Many voters just don't trust the Democratic Party. On a long list of things, this is the case. Obviously, voters also don't trust the Republican Party on a whole bunch of issues, including abortion now. But there are a long list of issues in which working class voters in particular are much more moderate than the Democratic Party is. And the Democratic Party has basically said to them, if you don't agree with us, you're not just wrong, but you're some version of ignorant or hateful. And I want to acknowledge that in part the Democratic Party has lost voters because of race and racism. That is true, and it is an important point. But I think the Democratic Party makes a big mistake when they said that the only reason people don't vote for us is because of racism. The Democratic Party often says to voters, if you don't support us, you don't understand your own interests, you're voting against your own interests, and you are ignorant or hateful. I think that's empirically wrong. I also think it's not a great way to win someone's vote by saying you're ignorant and hateful. And so while the Republican Party has continued to pursue an economic policy that hurts many working class people, the Democratic Party has basically told working class people, we don't respect your views enough on a long list of issues to have our own party positions change in response to yours. As a result, we've ended up with two political parties, neither one of which both represents the interests of working class Americans, roughly people without a four-year college degree, and manages to create a party in which those people feel welcome. This trend has accelerated over the last 5 years. The Democratic Party has lost support not only of white working class voters, but has meaningfully lost support among Latino and Asian working class voters over the last 5 years, and even a couple percentage points among black voters. And if you believe the polls, it might be more than a couple percentage points in 2024. So I realize that is kind of a grim litany of how we've ended up in a place where we have an economy that doesn't serve many Americans. But I actually end my note on an optimistic I end my book on an optimistic note, and it's why I started with A. Philip Randolph today. I continue to believe that our political system and our economy has the ability to fix its own problems. And we have that ability through the same tool that A. Philip Randolph used to defeat the Pullman Company and to face down FDR in the Oval Office. And it is the tool of small d democratic organizing. It is the tool of grassroots organizing. I understand that many Americans think that our political system is broken and rigged and will not be able to respond to their wishes. And I have some deep fears about certain aspects of American democracy, including the rise of autocracy that we now see within large parts of the Republican Party. However, it is still the case that the history of American democracy over the last 50 and 100 years, including recently, is actually cause for inspiration. What was it that made it possible for A. Philip Randolph to win that unbelievable underdog victory over the Pullman Company? It was political organizing. It was persuading people to join a union, and it was then the election of a government that promised to protect that union and advocate for its people. The labor movement in this country is a massive victory of democratic organizing. So is the civil rights movement, so is the women's movement, so is the disability rights movement of the 1970s. Those are arguably all examples on the political left. So is the anti-abortion movement. In 1973, when the Supreme Court passed Roe v. Wade, opponents of abortion did not respond by saying the system is hopelessly rigged and will never be able to change it. They responded by organizing and taking over the Republican Party and winning local elections and winning enough presidential elections to appoint judges who were friendly to it, and ultimately achieving a victory that almost no one thought they could achieve. And they did it without ever having more than 50% support in the national polls, right? Winning grassroots organizing victories doesn't always require 50% in the national polls. There are also recent victories on the political left. If I were here in 2000, would any of us have predicted that marriage equality would become the law of the land and that our friends and our relatives who are gay would be able to get married? I don't think I would have. I guess almost none of you would have as well. But the gay rights movement achieved remarkable victories in a short period of time by winning people over and by organizing, and by the way, by being respectful of Americans' moderate social views. How did the gay rights movement win? They won by tying itself to the military and arguing that they too should be able to serve in the military, and by holding up marriage, which is a fundamentally conservative institution. They won not by appealing to people who are already persuaded. They won by actually trying to persuade people of their views. There are other recent examples of grassroots political organizing succeeding in this country. The minimum wage movement to raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour has won in both red states and blue states. It's a reminder that many Americans are actually left of center on economics and right of center on many social questions. The effort to expand Medicaid in many red and blue states has also won. And when Donald Trump was president and tried to take away health insurance from millions of people by repealing Obamacare, what happened but a huge grassroots movement that at first seemed like it lacked the votes in Congress to prevent him from doing that, but that somehow showed up at town halls and made Congress feel like they're going to lose their jobs if they repealed Obamacare, and by a single vote prevented Obamacare from being repealed. I look at this history and I say, we should not give up on the American system as hopelessly rigged. We should instead say that if we had a movement that was actually devoted to lifting the material living standards of most Americans by giving them good wages, by giving them good schools, by giving them better, more affordable health care, that movement could actually succeed. The problem is that we haven't had such a movement on either the political right or the political left in recent decades. And if we did have such a movement, I think it could succeed. And a final note about Philip Randolph before I ask you all for your questions and disputations and anything else on your mind. I know why many people are pessimistic today. I understand all the reasons to shrug your shoulders or think, how can I have any effect, or to worry that we are doomed to a worse future than the past. But boy, if A. Philip Randolph did not give up with the odds that he faced in 1925, I don't think any Americans today should give up in the face of the odds that we face. Thank you so much for listening.
Okay, so David will take your questions, and Brian and John. Okay, so if you will just wait until the microphone has been passed to you so that our good friends from C-SPAN have an opportunity to make certain that the audio is recorded. Go ahead, and I'll let David call his own questions.
So am I supposed to wait till microphones are there, or I point and then?
They'll raise their hand,
Great.
and then I'll...
Great.
There we go.
Or feel free, you don't have to wait for me.
Clearly, I hear your message that organizing has some potential fruits. And it seems like A. Philip Randolph took his organization and had it very narrowly focused on a few points. So what might you suggest those points be for whomever, the worker in the United States? What would those points be for today?
Thank you. Just to continue, this is also that this is in the news. This is by no means will solve every problem, but I do think labor unions are a really important part of it. And let me start by saying I've been in a labor union, and I was at times really frustrated with it. And I've been a manager at the New York Times, and I've at times been frustrated with the union when I've been at the New York Times. So unions have a lot of flaws, but all institutions have flaws. Corporations have flaws as well. And if we end up in a situation where corporations don't have any other institution to check them and check their power, we end up with the situation that we've had in recent decades in this country or in the early decades of the 20th century with really high inequality. And so I think labor unions are really vital for lifting the wages of lower and middle income workers. One of the other charts in the book, I show the percentage of Americans who are in unions and compare it to, the percentage of Americans who are in unions over time and compare it to the percentage of income going to the bottom 90% of workers. And the two charts are like, they move in almost perfect rhythm. And so I really do think a hugely important piece of organizing involves labor unions. I don't think I wrote enough about labor unions in my 20 years as a reporter, and working on this book and reading the economic research and the history persuaded me that they're even more important than I had understood. And so that means both things like what the UAW has just done, which is they kicked out leadership that was kind of corrupt and self-interested and replaced them with leadership that was actually much more focused on the workers, and they won. But I don't think this can happen without actually changes in the laws. So to answer your question really directly, I think people can organize to make sure that when Congress has a chance, it can make it possible for workers who actually vote to join a labor union be able to join one. Right now, in many places, Starbucks is an example, workers at a store will vote to form a union, and the company will find ways to fire the union organizers and delay, just the way the Pullman Trump company tried to, and prevent that union ever from forming. And if you look at kind of every Democratic president of the modern era, they've said they're in favor of labor law reform, and they haven't gotten it passed. It's the only major part of the Great Society that LBJ didn't get passed, labor law reform, the only one. And he didn't push it. He didn't do the famous LBJ lobbying on it. Jimmy Carter had to choose between the Panama Canal Treaty and labor law reform, and he chose to prioritize the Panama Canal Treaty. It's Clinton and Obama didn't get it passed. Biden said he wanted to. Now, Biden didn't have the votes, but that's where we come back to organizing. Obama was able to pass healthcare reform because he campaigned on it. He said, I'm going to do it. Biden was able to pass this huge climate bill because he campaigned on it and he said he was going to do it. I think the only way we're going to see a meaningful turnaround for organized labor is if a future president says, I will do this, not as my fifth item if I win, but my first or second. Presidents tend to do or try to do what they say is their top priority. There are all kinds of other things as well, but that would certainly be high on the list.
Considering the campaigns of A. Philip Randolph that you so eloquently illuminated, were you to be called on to be an advisor to the Democratic Party, what 3 campaigns would you ask them to emphasize as winning campaigns for the next election?
So is this more of a policy question, or is it more a reference?
Policy-wise, what do you think would be winning policies or campaigns or initiatives that they could emphasize that would be winning for the party?
So I think, so if we're talking, I'm not trying to duck your question, I'm trying to answer it precisely. So I think for 2024, that's what the question's about. Yes, okay. So for 2024, that's a slightly different answer than 2028. So for 2024, look, Americans are deeply concerned about prices. They're really concerned about prices. And having President Biden, who's, I have to say, who's passed a lot of really impressive legislation, right? He's really tried to stop this investment slump that I talked about. And some of his bills have passed with bipartisan support. The infrastructure bill, the semiconductor bill. So he's got a really impressive record in many ways. But people are unhappy about how much prices have gone up. And the fact that inflation is moderated, which means prices in the last year haven't gone up as fast as they used to have gone up, does not persuade people, right? Like if you're paying $6 for a box of cereal, but the percentage increase over the last 12 months was lower than the percentage increase over the previous 12 months, you're still not happy about paying $6 for a box of cereal, right? And so I think it's very important for, instead of telling people that actually the economy is great, I think it's really important to acknowledge the fact that people are feeling a lot of pressure from prices. And Biden's actually done a fair number of things to try to counteract that. He's reduced the price of hearing aids. He's reduced the price of insulin. He's done a whole bunch of stuff like that. He's reduced the price of clean energy. By the way, he's also opened Alaska to more drilling, and so he could claim that he's tried to reduce your gas prices, right? But he seems afraid of saying that because environmental activists will give him a hard time. I don't think he should be so afraid of environmental activists. He's the most climate-friendly president in history, and if he loses, the person he loses to will not be climate-friendly. So I think prices are really important. I think immigration is vital. I think the Democratic Party has gone very far left on immigration. If you go back and read what Barack Obama said about immigration, it wouldn't really be welcome in today's Democratic Party. I think the Democratic Party needs an answer that includes border security. Right now, our policy is we're not comfortable with the system that keeps people from entering this country. And once they enter this country, we often allow them to stay for years. And that has created a system that, when Republicans call it an open border, that's a little bit of an exaggeration. It has some truth to it. Basically, the Democratic Party has gotten very uncomfortable with border security and with deportation and with really anything like that. And to me, it's actually crueler to allow people to enter and stay here for 7 years and then kick them out. And so I think the Democratic Party needs a better policy on immigration that acknowledges what every country in the world acknowledges, which is we have borders, and they're real borders, and we will enforce them. And not everyone can come into our country. Those are two. Let me try to think of a third, and I promise I'll come back to it as we do it.
In that the two major political parties are as flawed as you say, which I think most of us would believe, does that suggest there's a need for a third party?
So that's a great question. So I think that, look, there is a lot of dissatisfaction with the two parties. I think it's important to recognize where much of that dissatisfaction comes from. So there's it's not in the book, but one of my absolute favorite charts about American politics asks people a bunch of questions about both economic policy and social policy, and then puts them on two different axes, right? One, their economic views, one, their social views. And so if I remember it right, the economic views are actually right to left, and the social views are up and down. So let's imagine in the upper right-hand corner, we have, and imagine that each person who responds to the survey, and they gave it to thousands of people, is a dot. Okay? So in the upper right-hand quadrant, we've got 4 quadrants here, right? In the upper right-hand quadrant are people who are to the right on both economics and social policy, right? This would be someone who wants low taxes and abortion restrictions. That is a very crowded quadrant, right? The lower left is also a very crowded quadrant. That is everyone who is left on both things, right? They believe in reproductive rights, and they believe in relatively generous safety net. So those are Democrats and those are Republicans up here. It's the other 2 quadrants that are kind of more complicated, right? It's either people who are more conservative on social issues and more liberal on economic issues, or vice versa. And one of the things that I notice is that in the circles that I tend to be in, I live in Washington, I spend a lot of time in New York, I'm almost always with people who went to college, I'm with people who often make more money than the American median. They imagine that where Americans swing voters, and thus the best place to create a third party, is economically conservative and socially liberal, right? Sort of libertarians. You know, I want light regulation, but I'm also in favor of marijuana legalization or something like that. So they imagine that that is actually where the swing voters are. In fact, that is the most empty quadrant in American politics. The other quadrant is really quite full. So these are people who are socially moderate to conservative and economically progressive, right? They want gun rights and they want Medicare. And when you think about that, it actually makes a lot of sense. That's where a lot of Americans are. These are the people who voted for both Barack Obama and then Donald Trump. Those are the swing voters of American politics. Those are the people who often feel abandoned by the Republican Party because of their support for big business and low taxes and their attempts to cut social programs. And they're the people who feel abandoned by the Democratic Party because of their stance on guns and their stance on immigration and their stance on a whole bunch of different things. And so if a third party would emerge, and I'm not sure that it will, I would just keep in mind that it might emerge from a place that would look very strange to gatherings that often are in places where I am. And I think it might, and that's why my friend Ross Douthat, who's a columnist at the Times, said that actually Joe Manchin would be a pretty good third-party candidate if he chooses to run, because he actually embodies those things. That's my way of ducking your request for a prediction. And if I gave you a prediction, you should ignore it. Remember when we told you Hillary Clinton was going to win?
First of all, excellent job tonight. We've been coming for quite a while, and you did a very good job. We teach U.S. history locally at high school, the local high school.
Thank you. And thank you for doing that.
So just to follow up when you talked about the Democratic Party and their stance on immigration.
Yes.
Do you see the party doubling down on that going forward? Do you see them trying to make some meaningful change in order to try to repair, you know, because obviously both parties are seriously fractured now, obviously. Do you see that changing at all? Do you see anybody within the party taking some leadership? What are your thoughts there? There
are people in the party who have tried to address this, including, and I'm sorry, some of their names are escaping now, but including some of the House members from Texas, right, who have been significantly more hawkish on the need for border security. I think Joe Biden's personal instincts are actually kind of more conservative on this issue. But I think that it is often very hard for parties to push back against the kind of, and I don't say this disdainfully, I was talking about how important political activism from their kind of activist base, right? We've seen this with the Republican Party. They've ended up with this really extreme position on abortion that most Americans really don't like at all. And the Republican Party kind of can't get out of its own way because of how much of their kind of policy bench, right? The people who work at think tanks really care deeply about this. And that's part of the Democratic Party's problem on immigration. But look, the Democratic Party's position on immigration is really not popular. I mean, when you think about the terrible ways that Donald Trump talks about immigration, I mean, let's be honest, the racist ways Donald Trump has talked about immigration, the fact that when you ask American voters whose position do you support on immigration, more of them support Donald Trump's than Joe Biden's, and a significant number of Trump's support comes from non-white voters on this issue. To me, that's really a flashing warning sign of how outside of basically the political mainstream the Democratic Party has ended up on this issue. My general instinct is when parties end up out of the line with public opinion, they'll eventually snap back on it. The problem is that the kind of authoritarian threat that Trump presents is real, and so the idea that the Democratic Party might meaningfully reduce its chance of winning the 2024 election on this is a mildly frightening prospect, and it's not clear that it will actually adjust its policy in time for 2024.
I have two questions, sir. One is that
I'm sorry, I'm not seeing the microphone.
Here.
Excellent, thank you.
I'm sorry. I have two questions. One, tonight, as I was coming in, KERA was discussing the fact that the president had signed not legislation, but some regulation that is going to require that large corporations make it less difficult for their employees to unionize.
Yes.
And so I wonder what the impact of that is. And then the second part has to do with the immigration issue. We are a country that is not replacing our population, and we have enormous needs for immigration. Now, they may be immigration by status, but how would you discuss with people who are opposed to immigration the needs that the country actually has for levels of immigration in a variety of statuses?
Yeah. So I didn't hear that report. I don't think the current Congress, I assume Biden may have signed an executive order to make it easy. Yeah. So executive orders are meaningful and useful, but they're just much, much less powerful than legislation. So the executive order that Biden has signed today, I will take a look at it. It's not going to be revolutionary, almost by definition. We exist in a political system where the big stuff Congress needs to pass, and I think we should want it to be that way. And so it may make a meaningful difference. Biden really is deeply sympathetic to organized labor and understands its importance. I mean, he walked a picket line, right? And it may make some difference, but not a huge one. Look, Americans are in favor of immigration, right? Americans understand what a glorious history we have, that when other countries have turned away immigrants, we haven't. You know, my grandfather arrived here on a ship fleeing France. He arrived in New York on February 26, 1940, right? If he didn't get here, I might not be here today. He was a German Jew living in Paris in 1940. And many, many other Americans have versions of this same story of themselves, right? Their parents, their grandparents have escaped terrible oppression. They've come here seeking a better life. We are a nation of immigrants. I think with an immigration policy that actually enforces the laws that are on the books and comes up with a system that we agree on about how many immigrants we're going to admit for different categories, I think it can be a really important part of it. And it is true that given our population, we probably should admit really substantial numbers of immigrants in coming decades. But we should also think about, as your question suggested, the mix of immigrants that we're letting in. We have had in this country a big increase in inequality in recent decades. And so I think that argues for tilting the immigrants we let in to provide more competition for people who have jobs like mine, and less competition, relatively less competition for people who have blue-collar jobs, basically kind of pushing against the inequality of recent decades. One of the things I learned the most when writing this book was the history of the immigration bill of 1965. It's chapter 9 in the book, It's my mother-in-law's favorite chapter, and I adore my mother-in-law. And so I won't trace the whole history of the 1965 bill here. All I would say is, when Congress passed the 1965 bill, they promised repeatedly that it would not lead to an increase in the number of workers competing for blue-collar jobs. LBJ promised that. Teddy Kennedy promised that. Republicans who voted for the bills promised it. They promised it again and again and again. They said this bill will not meaningfully alter the level of immigration. We're just getting rid of the old system of immigration, which was horribly racist, and we're treating everyone the same. But we're not increasing the amount of immigration. That was a completely false promise. I think they believed it at the time. I don't think they were lying. But just as the Reagan promises of the 1980s have not been fulfilled, the promises that they made in 1965 about what they were doing to our immigration system ended up being completely false. And so that to me is yet another reason why it's important to take seriously the concerns of people who are worried about immigration. Because in the past, our immigration system, basically, it is a triumph of human rights because we got rid of the old system, but it's a failure of democracy because it really was sold to the American people under false pretenses. Make the call. Oh, I'm making the call. Okay.
So I think if we compare the New Deal era versus today, we can draw a lot of parallels. Both periods were preceded by sort of a global shock. The Great Depression before 32, and then obviously the global pandemic before today. I think both periods, fiscal spending impulse is alive and well. And finally, this groundswell of active labor in both periods. I'd just be curious if you could kind of compare and contrast the two, because I'm curious if, as unpopular as the view is, we might sort of be in the early stages of a 1940s to 70s type economic boom.
So I do think a friend of Andy Graybill's, Jefferson Cowie, who's a professor at Vanderbilt, has written this short little book that's absolutely wonderful called The Great Exception, about how basically we're not going to get the New Deal again, that it depended on this outrageously unlikely series of events. We had a president presiding over a depression who didn't do much for 3 years. I mean, Hoover was in office for 3 years more than 3 years after the 1929 crash. We had this bizarre alliance between Southern segregationists and Northern liberals. They're just and then we had a war to kind of cement it in. So I don't think we're likely to get another New Deal. But I do think that even if it is happening more slowly, I don't think it's out of the question that we're at a little bit of a turning point. I mean, both the Democratic Party and the Republican Party have been reflective about some of the policies of recent decades that haven't worked. I mean, people talk about trade differently than they did just 10 years ago. Right? Joe Biden talks about labor unions differently from Democratic presidents before him did. I don't want to exaggerate how much movement you see, but there are Republicans who are concerned about how powerful big companies have gotten. Now, some of their concerns are conservative. That's a good thing. The way you get unlikely alliances is by having people of different views worried about the same things for different reasons. As I mentioned, the infrastructure and the semiconductor bills got some Republican votes. So I think there are signs that parts of our political system are saying, hey, you know what we've been doing isn't really working. Let's reflect on it and think about it. I think there was a question also, right there you go, right next to you. She has her hand up right there.
Hi, and again, thank you. You've been fantastic. I just wanted to maybe try to help bring us together. What do you see are some of the unifying things that both parties can be unified on, where they agree, where we can really move forward to that shining, unified future?
Yeah, so that's a lovely way to play off the last question. So, look, you really do see. The fact that you got these bipartisan bills passed on infrastructure, right? It's kind of I don't want to exaggerate it, but it's a little way of reanimating that old spirit of Eisenhower, right? That old kind of spirit of investment in this country. The same is true of semiconductors. And I actually think it's quite healthy that much of it is in response to concerns about China overtaking the US. A lot of the reasons Eisenhower made that investment were because of concerns about the Soviets overtaking the US, right? A foreign rival can focus the mind and create bipartisanship. So I think that is sort of one area. look, I think that I do actually think there's a very sensible potential compromise on immigration, right? It involves real border security. It involves a path to citizenship for the dreamers. It involves thinking about what kind of future immigration system we want to make the process for becoming citizens less miserable. I think it has to involve a meaningful number of slots for people who are fleeing political oppression. Right? But we also have to change the rules. So, everyone sort of learned you show up and you say you're fleeing political oppression, right? And then you go into a different category. We do not have a system, and no country has a system in which grounds for your country's richer than my country, that is not grounds for asylum in no country in the world. It's de facto becoming a little bit grounds for asylum in the United States. That just doesn't work in a rich country. But I think there really is a compromise there on immigration. And so I do think that what you've essentially had is you have had the Republican Party realize, wait a second, the kind of old model of our being the party of big business and Wall Street, that's not popular even with our own voters. Donald Trump proved that, right? He said all these things no Republicans had said, and he just wiped the floor with his competition. He said, I'm not touching Social Security and Medicare, trade is bad, right? And then he said a whole bunch of other stuff, right? But he beat all of the Paul Ryan types in his party, and he's going to do it again. And setting aside Donald Trump, and his extremely alarming attitudes about democracy and the Constitution and all those things, that notion that the sort of big business laissez-faire view of the Republican Party actually isn't popular with the Republican Party's own voters, I think is an important notion and actually can kind of potentially lead us to a little bit more bipartisan compromise. If you're a conservative who's interested in these ideas, or if you're just interested in the conservative version of these ideas, I really recommend the work being done by this group called American Compass. It's started by a former aide to Mitt Romney named Orrin Cass, and it's really tried to imagine a different version of conservatism that is truly conservative, but also acknowledges that conservatism doesn't have to mean laissez-faire economics.
I think it's a great, if the microphone goes, it's a great way to get
Thank you all. What a wonderful audience. Thank you.
Sorry about the microphone failure there. Again, there are books for purchase outside, and David will be here to sign them afterwards. Thanks so much for coming out this evening.